Welcome to the Heal, Thrive, Dream podcast, where trauma survivors become healthy thrivers. Each month, we'll feature a theme in the trauma recovery and empowerment field. To promote your recovery, healing, and learning how to build dreams, here's your host, Karen Robinson, transformational coach and therapist.
Hi, welcome to the Heal, Thrive, Dream podcast. Today, our guest is a native of Detroit. Her name is Jan Canty. Jan is a psychologist, writer, photographer, educator, consultant, and cancer survivor. She holds a terminal degree in psychology as well as a post-doctoral fellowship from Wayne State University. School of Medicine, sorry. I should say that again. Fellowship from Wayne State University, School of Medicine, Department of Family Medicine. Then life happened and grew dark. It was July of 1985. Her spouse of 11 years went missing and was found murdered 250 miles away. The media exposure was immediate and relentless. Reporters tailed her to the medical examiner building, disrupted the funeral, and published a map to her house on the front page of the news. After the trial and convictions in December, she quietly moved deep into the Midwest and began her 30-year redacted life. Well, that was quite the opening, wouldn't you say?
All accurate.
Yeah, I guess I'll start with, I didn't read your complete bio, of course, because it's really long and that will be on the show notes, but is there anything else in your bio that you want to share with the audience from the get-go?
Not really. That's a pretty good summary of it.
Okay, yeah, I just did the first two paragraphs. Of course, the second paragraph is very captivating, maybe triggering for anyone listening who's had a murdered loved one or a deceased loved one from suicide. And of course, I don't like it when podcasters, I'm losing my words today. I don't like it when they dig too deep and wound their guest. And so I want to be conscientious of that. Like, I know you've had many years of healing and working on yourself, but you've also had other traumas. What do you feel comfortable in sharing about what happened with your husband? Like, what feels okay to share at this point?
There's no limitations. I will share whatever is useful to help others.
Okay. So what was your relationship like with him before he passed? Were the two of you doing okay?
I thought so. He was very supportive of my aspirations. I thought he was very supportive of us financially. That turned out not to be true. And I thought he was faithful. That also turned out not to be true. So the point I'm making is that from my perspective, while he was alive, I was happy. And the only change I could say I saw towards the end of his life was he became more preoccupied, more quiet, more introspective. And I attributed it to our 18-year age difference. And I thought maybe he wasn't feeling well. I suggested he get a physical. He postponed that, but he did stop smoking. He was of average weight and, so far as I know, average health. That was about the only red flag, and it was pretty subtle. But after he died, I just was inundated with news about him. He was leading a double life, and much of what I thought to be true wasn't. And I came away from that experience after a couple of months of feeling like I didn't even know who I'd been married to.
Okay, so I would probably label this, not that you need a label, but because you're like, oh, this is my life. I know what the label is, but it's in my field, we call that complicated trauma. Well, you're a psychologist, you know.
Mm-hmm.
It's very complicated to lose someone unexpectedly, and then for it to be a murder, and then to find out all this information about his double life, like that just
while you're
that's a
in the
lot to
public
take in.
spotlight. I mean, all this
Yeah.
was unfolding in the news and on television, and I avoided them the best I could, but it was difficult. They followed me. I had to change my phone number So often I had to start writing it down. After the map to my house was published in the news, we had what we call in the death and homicide survivor community, we had death tourists come by, and they'd stop and point and get out of their car and have their picture taken in front of my house. And in time, they started stealing things like mementos for them from my house on the outside. And I think what comes with that is a sense of entitlement. The more your story is in the news, the more people feel entitled, familiar with you, and that you have an obligation to fill them in if they bump into you in real life. And that became another source of being upset, is I lost my privacy on top of everything else. So I became more isolated in the process. And this was easier to do that back then because this was 1985. The internet had not yet come about. So it was easier to get your privacy than it is today.
Right. So you learned that your spouse had another family as well, another wife? Did he have other
No,
kids?
he had, what I say, led a double life. For the 18 months prior to his death, he had developed a friendship, I guess you could call it a friendship, with a man who was a pimp and his prostitute girlfriend, and started financially supporting them to the tune of buying them cars and paying rent and groceries, and led them to believe that he was a widower and that his name was Dr. Miller, and that he worked at Detroit Receiving Hospital, and that he had a daughter that was estranged from him, none of which was true. They eventually did find out the truth, and when the two collided, he panicked, as he should. So the double life he led was really this split between his presentable life with me, being married, living in the suburbs, and going to work every day. And he really wasn't at work towards the end. He was spending a lot of time with them and supplying them, like I said, with all kinds of money, to the tune of, in 1985 dollars, it was about $150,000. So we were in debt after he died. There was financial repercussions. We owed years of taxes. We were behind on the mortgage. We were behind on his office rent. We were behind on car payments. His father's coin collection was missing. And so was an emergency album that towards the end of his life, I got the vibe something was happening. Some danger was approaching. I never thought what it was turned out to be the case. But because I had this sense that something was bad, that was going to happen, I assembled an album of our house listing all the contents and their approximate value in case the house should burn down or get burglarized. I mean, that was where my head was going. And I mean, I had included in that open drawers, open closets, open cupboards, a map to the house, so that if I had to report everything to the insurance company, I could be very precise about what we had lost. He had given that album to them. So they not only knew what we had, where it was located, the layout of our house, they figured out where he worked. And about a week before he died, I had been followed home, but I didn't connect it. I didn't think it had anything to do with him. And a few days before he died, my parents were supposed to arrive soon for vacation in July to our house. So I was getting the yard ready and pruning, and I found footprints on the side of our house it's like there's no sidewalk or anything, or it's the common lawn between my house and my neighbors with a small fence in between. And not near a sidewalk. There was no place where a pedestrian could have easily tossed 3 fresh cigarettes that were on the ground near the footprints. And we had had days of rain. That's how I knew that they were fresh cigarettes. Mm-hmm. And they were partially smoked. And I knew that a cigarette takes approximately 20 minutes to smoke. So somebody had been there at least an hour, if not more, beneath our kitchen window. That concerned me. So I just had this sense something's happening, but I couldn't put my finger on it. And when I brought it up to Al, he was rather dismissive and you have an active imagination, just the typical gaslighting stuff. And so he kind of humored me, and we had a alarm system installed, and he offered to get a dog. And I said, that's not what I want. What I want is to feel safe, and that's not going to do it. So I guess you could say there were, quote, red flags or warning signs, but it didn't connect in my mind. I was very busy at the time too. I was finishing up my post-doctoral fellowship. I was working 60 hours a week and commuting. I wasn't even home a lot. So there wasn't a lot of time to just sit down and dwell. I was
or
on
play
the go a lot.
detective. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Did you ever find out like why he was living this lifestyle? Was it about drugs, sex, money? Like what was it about for him? Did you ever find that out?
I have a chapter in my book on this, and I believe after poring over documents that were available to me and interviewing people who knew him as a high school student and so forth, what I believe was the driving force behind all of this was, and this is going to oversimplify it a little bit, but I had outgrown him. He needed me as an audience. He needed me to look up to him. And because when we met, I was a high school grad. I was 18 years younger. I was impressed with his standing in life. He had money. And at the end, I had more education than him. I had no need for his money. I could make my own. I was on the brink of that, I should say, because I was just finishing my postdoctoral fellowship. And I started to talk more about what I knew and theories and research that I'd read. And he wanted no part of that. It ruffled his feathers when I did that. So I stopped talking about those things. And I think what happened was he turned to somebody else who needed him in the same way I used to need him, which was Big Daddy, somebody to sit there and impress and financially support. And who better than a couple of drug addicts, because they need your money. Mm-hmm. He never did drugs. He was tested because he had a psychotic break during all this and was sent to a hospital. He was tested for drugs. There wasn't any in his system, but he willingly supplied them with it. So I think he needed an audience because I wasn't filling that bill anymore. And it's striking to me how when I look at a photo of the woman who was the sex worker, she looked a lot like I did when we met.
Oh,
and
wow.
Was about the same age.
Now, was it that man or did that couple, are they the ones that killed him?
Yes. He ran out of money. They didn't take to that well. And they were high. And I think I'll never know this. I think he suspected he was going to die. And here's why I say that. After he went missing, I went down to his office to find out where he'd been and try to piece together what had happened. And it's the only time in his life where he really just detailed his office and got it all ready and fixed up. And he had left certain things out in a very orderly, like his checkbook and phone book. And it wasn't like him. It was very out of character. He tended to be kind of disorganized. And the fact that he knew he had no money left to give them and that he willingly went to their house that night and that he knew at that point in time that the gig was up because they had discovered his real name. They had his address. They had my real name. They had the address of my office. I think he knew it was up and he provoked him. This was the guy who killed him was twice his size. My husband was not a big guy. He looked a little bit like Woody Allen, kind of small and big glasses. And this guy looked like Mr. Clean. He was huge. He was a biker guy. And they started arguing when they discovered he had no money. And Al reportedly pushed him and said, "It's my money. I'll do whatever I want with it." And when he pushed John Carl Fry, he accidentally tripped over a small stool on the floor, which enraged him and got a bat and clubbed him to death and then dismembered him. And ordered his girlfriend, Dawn, go out and make some money. Get out of here. So she went out, but she came back. That was her chance to flee if she wanted. She came back. She helped with the packaging of his remains and driving him north to Petoskey to dump them near the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. So she was involved as well, but not directly in the homicide.
I can't even imagine what your life was like learning that. Like, were you?
I was fuzzy. I was disbelieving. I kept thinking they got the wrong guy. This isn't right. They're making mistakes. I needed that, I think, buffer to let it sink in because because remember, this is just part of I still had the financial pressure on me. I wasn't feeling well. I had
trauma.
people parading by my house. I had detectives at my door. I had my patients to think about who were wanting to know, are you going to come back?
Yeah.
My parents were worried about me because they hadn't yet arrived. And I was alone in this big house that I never even really wanted. He wanted it, so we bought it. But it was a big house. It was 6 bedrooms, 6 bathroom house. And I was alone in it. And I never even wanted it. And it felt like
scared too.
A public building. And I didn't
Yeah.
know. And the police told me they didn't know if they had everybody involved. So for a while, they were following me. And they would occasionally drive by my house and have a spotlight just to check for shrubbery and stuff in the windows. And that was, it was good, but it was also unnerving when I'd see the light on the inside. So there was a lot of irons in the fire, and it certainly did not give me a moment to grieve. It did not give me a moment to try to even piece it together. I was so busy trying to survive physically, financially, safety-wise, legally, that I had no time for anything that could have been postponed for years.
How did you not have your own psychotic break with all that going on?
Early on, well, my parents were very wonderful parents, and they raised me to be strong and independent. And they did eventually come into town. They did come early. They helped me a great deal. My dad, bless his heart, he took over the phone in the front door. My mom insisted I start eating again and politely told me, you really need a shower. I don't know how long it had been, days since, because in my mind, it wasn't days. My mind, it was one long day that spanned a week or 10 days or what, because I wasn't sleeping. I was catnapping. So the night and day pattern was totally gone. And I couldn't remember the last time I ate or drank water or took a shower. That was meaningless to me. I was so busy putting out fires. That was way at the bottom of my list. Mm-hmm. So I attribute my ability to withstand this a lot to my parenting that I had. I had wonderful parents.
Yeah.
And also anger and the feeling that, you got our money, you got my privacy, you got my husband. I can't afford this house. You've probably ruined my vocation, which I have been in school with for 10 years to earn, and I'm right on the edge of opening my practice. That's probably gone. My physical health is suffering, but that's it. You are not allowed. I will not allow you to take one more thing from me. I draw a hard line right here. And I don't know what that means. I don't know how I'm going to get past that line. I don't know what it is I need to do yet. But I was bound and determined not to be any more collateral damage than I already was. And I kept my promise to that. From that moment on, I looked out for me. I did what was right for me, up to and including tell detectives, I don't want to be interviewed anymore. You've had my fill today. I'll tell you more tomorrow. I'm done. I can't absorb anymore. I don't want to talk about it anymore. My friend, bless her heart, before my parents could come, I should say, they were very kind, and they offered me their guest room upstairs, and they had a back entrance to that room. And they said, here's a key. Use it whenever you want. No questions asked. Come and go as you want. Use it like a hotel room. You don't even have to interface with us. And that was wonderful because I knew if I was there, I wasn't home. so nobody could reach me. They didn't know where. And I'd go over there at night in the dark. I'd walk over there and keep my car in the driveway. And that was very comforting.
Yeah. I was going to ask you if you had some good friends to
Did.
support you. Yeah.
I did.
'Cause that can help get you through too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So after all this trauma, like when did you end up getting diagnosed with cancer? Was it many years later or right after? Like, do
Well,
you
it was many
contribute
years
all
later.
that? What do you contribute any of the stress from what happened to being susceptible, or is there family
I've
history?
asked I've asked oncologists about that, and if you ask 5, you'll get 3 saying yes and 2 saying no. I don't
Yeah.
know. But I do know this, that one of my strategies to get beyond this, to grow around it, was to get myself together physically. So I started going, this is years later, I started going to the gym at 6:30 in the morning, 4 days a week. And I belonged to a group of 5 women, and we worked out religiously. And if you weren't there, they'd be on the phone calling you like, where are you? And we did that for years. And finally we decided, hey, let's do some triathlons. Why not? We're ready.
Oh, wow.
So we started doing triathlons, and I started doing some very intense weightlifting. And with intense weightlifting, you have bone density, bone growth. And the kind of cancer I had disintegrates your bones. And every oncologist has told me that that's probably what saved my life, because my bones could withstand and respond to the treatment that they needed to give me, which was a bone marrow. I had many bone marrow aspirations of my hips, which to determine the degree of cancer in my bones. And I had to undergo a stem cell transplant. And the kind of transplant I had is called autologous, which means you donate your own stem cells. It's a very involved procedure. It takes months to prepare for it. And while you do not have the risk of rejection like you do with a donor stem cell transplant procedure, the downside of it is it never will cure what the cancer you have. What it will do is kick the can down the road. What it does is destroy your immune system so you can grow a new one. But not everybody does, and those that don't regrow one die. So it's a crapshoot. But if you're going to die anyway, is how I looked at it. So why not do this, you know?
Right. How
So
painful
I
was
did.
all that procedures?
Pardon me?
How painful was going through that process?
It was painful in parts. The bone marrow aspirations, because my bones were incredibly dense, they were very painful. They couldn't even use the usual tool on my hip bone to extract the bone marrow to get it out. They had to get a bigger one. It kind of looked like a corkscrew wine thing that you put in your body. But it's
Ah,
a cannula, so it's hollow, and they pull out like a spoonful of bone marrow from that through the cannula and analyze it under a microscope. But they can't anesthetize that. Your bones, there's no drug that's going to take the pain out of the bone. It will take
yeah.
the pain out of the tissue getting to the bone, but not once they're in there. And it's extremely cold, which is kind of a weird thing. That part was painful. And then the other part that was very painful, which I wasn't expecting, was in order to prepare for the stem cell transplant, they have to eradicate your immune system. And one of the drugs that they use for that is malphalin. Malphalin is a derivative of mustard gas. They just change a few molecules in it. And what that does is a side effect, not the intention, but the side effect of that is you shed all of the mucous membrane lining of your GI system. And that's incredibly painful. And that lasted 3 days. I was on IV morphine. It didn't even cut it.
Okay.
And that was bad. But they told me there's no short, you just got to do it, you know? So I did. That was at Christmas time. I remember that. And I had an incredible treatment team. I was so grateful to them. And that's one of the points I want to make, is that what got me through the murder, the strategies I took to get me through the murder, I re-employed them to get me through the cancer, and it worked for me.
Yeah.
One of which is, it was 2 things in particular. One is to focus on what was right, what had not changed as a result of the murder, what was still right in my world after the cancer, what did it not change? because you tend to focus on the negative. And secondly, to be grateful for resources that you do have. And that was drilled into me because another strategy I used in order to get myself back on track after the homicide was to volunteer internationally in remote areas of the world. And I saw things, heard things, smelled things I never would have ever dreamed. It's different than seeing it in National Geographic documentary and being there and the situations you find yourself in. And I came home from those remote places, remote villages, so appreciative of clean water, electricity,
hot water, yeah,
having rights as a woman, being able to travel and walk freely without a male on my arm, having my education, having a roof over I could go on.
I know.
And so it was with the cancer treatment. It's like I was grateful I had insurance. I had a world-class facility within an hour of me. I had my bone strength from the triathlon that I had done. Just 11 years prior to my diagnosis, there was no treatment for the kind of cancer I had. They would just basically say, get your affairs in order. That's how far it had come in 11 years. Geraldine Ferraro, who was a woman that ran for president and did not succeed, came down with the diagnosis of multiple myeloma during her campaign and thought, like the rest of us, oh, I'm just tired. I ache. And she was told when it was diagnosed, get your affairs in order. And she died. Tom Brokaw is another one that had the same diagnosis. He broke his back. That's the typical injury. With me, it was my arm. I was in training to do my 5th triathlon, and I was climbing up a muddy hill and slipped and caught myself with my right arm, and it fractured a spiral break in my right arm. And it was through and through. And I remember unzipping my sweatshirt and stuffing my arm in there like a sling and getting to 911 and getting to the hospital. And I just thought it was a broken arm. I thought it was weird that I broke it because the hill was so steep, I shouldn't have even gotten a bruise because it was like leaning against a wall. You fall against a wall 5 inches away, you shouldn't break a bone.
Yeah.
But the one good thing that came out of all of that was my husband and I were commuting. That's another story. I remarried. My husband and I were commuting, and my daughter volunteered to be with me because you had to have a caregiver during the 3-month procedure or they wouldn't do it. And she volunteered to be my caregiver, and it really brought us close. We still talk about it. She dropped everything and came and was exhausted in the process. When I look back on her photos, she looked 10 years older at the end than the beginning, but we've talked about it. And she said she would do it again in a heartbeat. I mean, we went through that together, and I was very grateful to have her. I adopted 2 children. She was 2 sisters. She was the youngest of the 2. And we were very close. And I think some of it has to do with that. So there are silver linings some of the times to this, it's not all, negative, but it's not something you'd wish on anybody either.
Right. Well, when I think, if I try to pretend to be you for a minute, I think about my low pain tolerance that I have, or used to be low. I'm getting tougher as I get older. And I think about you have survived intense emotional pain, intense physical pain, probably spiritual pain around that, but your spirit, like you are just such a tough cookie, to be able to focus on gratitude, to be able to look around the world and say, you know what? There is worse suffering. Like there's always somebody than a harder story than us.
Absolutely.
And if I focus on my supports, my resources, my gratitude, I'm going to be okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that
Powerful.
was very instrumental to me. In fact, years later, my other daughter, the older one of the 2, she started getting this little princess attitude, and I wasn't having it. Like, I only want clothes from Abercrombie and Fitch. And I thought, oh no, we're not going down this path. Mm-mm. So I said to her, how would you like to go to Kenya and look at the animals? Oh, you mean like a safari? I go, kind of. Yeah, we can do that. And there's a girls' school I want to visit. Okay. Because she was complaining about her school and the bus ride and anything. And while we're on the plane going over there, I said, oh, by the way, There's no electricity where we're going, no running water. You won't have a phone or a hair curler. And we're going to be working to build trusses for a girls' school. We're going to be living in a tent. I could just see the color draining from her face. And she was dumbfounded. And we had some funny things happen. One story, I've got it. It's just funny now. We had this tent and there was no fence around the area. We were near Olipikidange on a outlook over the Rift Valley, and it's the waterhole area. And they tell you stay in your tent dawn to dusk because the animals come to get the water and they're not friendly. Okay, so we stayed in our tent. We're not supposed to have food in our tent. Fine. And one night I heard this sniffing outside my tent or our tent. Like, what is that noise? And I said to my daughter, "Do you have any food in here?" And she goes, "Just licorice, red vines." And I go, "I told you not to bring any food." And she said, "You always told me that wasn't food," which I probably did say at some point. So we're stuffing our face with this red vine at, I don't know, 1 or 2 in the morning. I don't even like the stuff. And then the next morning, I asked one of the Maasai warriors who was guarding the camp area, what kind of animal tracks are around our tent. And he said it was one of those warthogs like Pumbaa. And I'm like, oh, glad we ate that stuff. But at any rate, to finish the story about my daughter, she came out of that experience not only wanting to go back, but by the time we got on the plane, the only clothes she had left to wear, because she'd given them all up, was what was on her back. She was trying to talk me into adopting more children. And she said it changed her life. When we got home, I asked her, "So what's changed? What do you think about your school? And what looks different to you now that we're here?" And she said, "I love my toilet. And
yeah.
I love paved roads. And I love having a hot shower at any time I want." And I said, "Don't ever take those things for granted. I won't, if you won't."
That's right.
And she dropped the attitude. It was great. It worked. And she felt proud of herself. Yeah. I love this one photo I have of her carrying a truss on her shoulders, as she's built it. I was so proud of her. And she didn't know she was capable of that. And I was glad to see she was. So my point being that it worked for me and her to do the international traveling as a volunteer. It's how I afforded to do it. And seeing things that I never would have seen, experiences I never would have had. And it changed my perspective on life. It reinforced my gratitude, and it changed my perspective on my situation tremendously.
I cannot tell you how much I love that.
I wouldn't have traded it for anything. I'd do it all over again in a heartbeat. My goal, my bucket list is to make every continent before I die. Then COVID happened and it set me back. But maybe I will. I don't know. I still have to make two. I want to go to South America and Antarctica. And
I think I just have the one left, the Antarctica. I think. Yeah, I've been to South America, Africa. Yeah, I think I just have Antarctica left.
I see. It's life-changing.
Yeah. I call myself a gypsy. I just love traveling.
I like that term.
Seeing and experiencing new things, hard things, adventure, different types of food, different people. It's amazing. I went to Myanmar, which used to be called Burma, and the Karens with the gold rings on their necks. I was like, who would have thought I would ever get to meet some Karens? They're called, the tribe is called Karens, and my name's Karen. And so I have photos of them with all the rings around their neck, because that was their version of beauty, having a really long neck. And I was just like, wow, just fascinating stuff.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And I always hoped I left the situation better than I found it. Yeah. Also by helping them, not only with that, but I also volunteered in a medical clinic and had my daughter do that as well in different countries. I went to India and volunteered there, but in Kenya, we did triage, and she got to see what starvation does to kids. And she didn't complain as much after that we got home.
Yeah. Well, maybe I need to book my kids right on a plane today. So I feel like I understand how you were able to heal, and it's really giving back. Really good,
Giving back and also connecting. As I said, this all happened before the internet. So one of the pieces that was still left over after I got myself together physically and socially was the psychological piece. I didn't know anybody who'd ever been in my shoes. I didn't know if I ever would. And I had a relative who I'm very close with who recommended I do a podcast. And I'm like, I don't even listen to podcasts. No pop filter from a microphone. I don't know anything about it. But she said, really, you ought to, that way you can help other homicide survivors. And I played around with the idea. I didn't jump into it, but I got encouragement to do it from others, and I did. And that was a godsend because through that, I learned a lot from my guests. I found amazing people with amazing stories, and it healed me. I found that I found my tribe. That's what it felt like. Like
Yeah.
these are people that speak my language. I don't even have to finish the sentence. So they know what I'm going to say. And I still learn from them. And I admire them. I respect them, and I appreciate them. And that has been that was like another huge piece of the puzzle that I didn't even initially recognize was needing to be filled, but that was filled by having the podcast. It's very important to me. And I don't believe, I could be wrong on this, but I don't believe there's another one like it out there that focuses merely on the aftermath of violent death, on the family members and loved ones. I don't know of one that does. There might be, but I've not heard of it.
No, I don't know either. What's the name of your podcast for people listening?
Domino Effect of Murder. And we finished, I have all my interviews lined up for the 4th season. It'll be done. And then next season in January, I'm starting season 5, and I'm already got enough interviews till about March. And it's not limited to people who have grieved a murder. I've also had experts on. I've had homicide detectives and attorneys and so forth. But I think the sweet spot still is homicide survivors. And their stories are all different. In fact, one time I sit down and listen to all my 2 seasons of podcasts back to back to back. And I was trying to listen I wanted to answer the question, is there a theme? Is there something that comes up again and again? And I came away with the conclusion, after listening to this for hours, that every homicide is unique, but the aftermath is not. They go through the social stigma, the isolation, the fear, the physical aftermath, the financial ramifications are awful. And nobody talks about the financial repercussions of it, but they're real. And there is such a lack of resources. And I think that's partly because we hide. We as a group, we homicide survivors stand in the corner. We don't want the spotlight. We're tired of courts. We're tired of looky-loos coming by and pointing their finger at us. And we're feeling, who's next? I don't want to have another person die. That we tend to pull away. And so we don't have resources. We don't speak out. There's a lot that is not known about us. And it's in part because of us, but it's also in part because society doesn't know what to do with us. People act real different when they find out that you've had a murder.
It's contagious, right? Like they could catch it from you.
Right.
Yeah,
in spite of the fact that we just gobble up true crime and murder on TV.
Yeah, but that's not real.
Yeah.
Tell us about your book. What's the title of your book?
I have 2. The first one is called A Life Divided, and that is a true crime memoir where I felt like the story had never been told from the inside looking out. And it was more complicated and it was not only more complicated, there were questions that were never answered by the media, like what would prompt him to do what he did. And the one question that always gets to me is, how could you not know that he led a double life? So I took upon myself to look at this much like an interview. Like if I was going to write a book about somebody else's life, what would I do? I would dig up news stories. I would interview people. I would look at old photographs, look at microfiche of newspapers, piece it together, lay it out a timeline, and let it write itself and be accurate as possible. And so that's what I did. I tried to be very accurate with facts and dates and times and names, but infuse it with my very subjective personal reactions to what was going on. For example, exiting the morgue when I went down to identify him, the fact was it was a Sunday morning at 6:30, and the news was camped on the steps of the morgue with their tripods and their cameras. That was factual. But the subjective part of it was for I was in such a state of mind and so sleep deprived at that point that when I glanced out the windows of the morgue for just a second, I thought I saw machine guns aimed at me. And I kind of blinked. I'm like, oh no, those are just tripods and cameras. But that's how I felt. Well, that's not going to be known by a reporter talking about the case.
Mm-hmm.
So I tried to be both as objective and accurate and factual as I could, but at the same time, helping the person voyeuristically walk through this whole thing through me. And hopefully at the end, make it more relevant for other homicide survivors, not just my own story. So that was A Life Divided. And then the second book, which is newer, it was just out this year, early this year, is called What Now? Navigating the Aftermath of Homicide and Suicide. And that is about a 475-page book that takes you through the process linearly. So it starts with the death notification, dealing with the media, understanding the investigation, preparing for court, the physical ramifications, understanding your children's needs, understanding the financial repercussions, on down the line to probation and parole and advocacy. And in writing the book, because of my podcast primarily, I had the fortunate experience of being able to tap into many experts, attorneys and detectives and others, to say, is this right? For example, there's a chapter in there on wrongful convictions of homicide survivors who have been wrongly convicted of the homicide of their loved one. And I wanted to write a chapter addressing that, as well as what to do if should you ever feel that's what's happening. But I'm not an attorney. So I wrote the chapter, and then I checked in with attorneys and said, would you just at least look this over and see if it's accurate, if I'd forgotten anything. There's also a chapter on probate and how to prepare your house for sale, because that's what I had to do. I couldn't afford living there. And what should you consider when you're in that process? And what, if you have to leave your house, how do you keep it safe? How do you keep it mold free? So I have a friend who builds houses for a living, so he helped me write that chapter. So I had the input of about 18 other people. And so I pulled that together and listed a lot of resources at the back. And it's not written just for homicide survivors and suicide survivors. It's also written for their best friends, because there's a whole chapter on what friends can do, which is a lot. There is so much that we need them for. And that's all condensed in one chapter. There's a practical tips on what to do when the media comes knocking, your options if you want no cooperation, some cooperation, or full cooperation. So I tried to make it as comprehensive as I could. That's just why it got to be as long as it could. But I also wrote it in such a way that if a chapter did not apply to you, like crime scene cleanup, you didn't have to read it. You still wouldn't miss any. It still would be continuity. So, and if there was an important point there that you might not catch, I put it in another chapter so you wouldn't miss it. Because not everybody has to deal with crime scene cleanup.
Right.
Thank God. Yeah. But there are people that do, and they don't know where to turn, and they don't know how they can get ripped off by those individuals. Here's just one example that's currently in the courts right now in Florida. There's a woman by the name of Michelle Sayers who lived in Florida and whose veteran husband took his life in their own home. She called Crime Scene Cleanup Company. They came, they cleaned it up, and without her permission and without her awareness, they videotaped the whole thing, before and after, posted it on the internet, on YouTube, and her twin young sons ran across it and were mortified to learn this is where their father died. She's taken them to court. There's no laws against what they've done. that I know of. Like, so what they're using is invasion of privacy. But in New Zealand, it's absolutely illegal. You cannot take video footage of a crime scene cleanup without permission of the owner. Here, it's legal. And so I have a blog on my website, and I write a lot of articles. And the series I'm doing right now is different ways that homicide survivors are exploited. The chapter I just wrote is by the funeral industry. It's just repugnant what they do to separate you from your money. And I'm going to post one tomorrow on how the media takes advantage of you. Then there's crime scene cleanup companies that take advantage of you. Because you're so vulnerable. You're so vulnerable and so naive. You're just ripe for the picking.
And you just want it done. You just want and you're like, just
want it to go away.
You want it to go away. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So the exploitation is another dimension of all this that people don't understand. There's a lot of information that is news, even to clinicians, that they don't have an inkling about, that is very important. Like the financial repercussions of death, of a homicide, are so incredible. Nobody talks about it. No, I wasn't prepared. Just as an example, you're going to need your own attorney. You're going to need more childcare. You're going to have more medical expenses because your own health is going to be flaring up. You're going to have security issues involved. So you might want to have a security system involved. And on it goes, and to the point where the average family is in debt about $5,500 from associated costs. And it is true that many communities do offer crime victim funds, but usually they only reimburse you, and it can take up to 2 years to be reimbursed, and it's never for the full amount. And if you have a crime scene cleanup in your home, that can run $25,000. Where's that money coming from? Especially if you're not able to work and the breadwinner was the one that was murdered. So how many clinicians know about that fact?
Yeah.
So
I was a military social worker, so I do know some of that stuff.
But the average clinician would not.
I know.
They don't teach this stuff in school.
Yeah, we're different, I think, is what it is too. Like, we give a damn. And so we're going to dig into those resources and find out like what exists. Like, I had a woman who lost her husband. I think he was a captain in a motorcycle crash. It wasn't a homicide, but the bank wouldn't let her get her money. And so she's in my office, and I'm like, well,
let her get her money.
They wouldn't let her take money out of the account because it was in his name. And I said, well, how are we going to do therapy if you're sitting here worried about this financial trauma? I'm going to help you get your money. And so I talked to Teller, I talked to the manager, and I'm like, I had to really harshly advocate for her. And so they're like, yes, ma'am, the funds will be available for her today. I'm like, how is she supposed to bury this man?
Right.
You know? And so they finally listened, and and that's the kind of support people need in the moment. She didn't need to sit there and talk about her feelings. She needed concrete help in the moment.
Yep. You're so busy treading water. Grief is a luxury. I had to wait 2 years before I could start processing it because I had to relocate. I had to pay off bills. I had to get my health back. I had to start a new job. So it just kept going as later. I'll get to it later. And it was 2 years before I could really exhale and sit and start processing. And even when I did, I found myself relocated to a very, very tiny town on purpose, where people wouldn't know me. There was no resources there. There wasn't even grief therapy then.
I believe it.
So you got to kind of figure it out yourself, And there was
you had some
no
tools.
podcasts.
Yeah, and you had some tools because you went to school to be a psychologist. Thank God,
There
right?
was no training on this. There's no training on this. There still isn't. I recently looked at various graduate programs in social work and psychology and psychiatry to find if there's even one class offered on homicide, on grief following homicide, or grief following homicide and suicide. There isn't. They consider trauma as trauma, whether you're raped or whether you survive a tsunami. It's all the same. And I'm like, no, it isn't. If you are in a tsunami, you have different problems. You have disease, for example, immediate concerns about disease because of the pollution and the water. all that. But you don't have to think about going to court. So it's not identical. And so that's my goal in the podcast and the book, is to get information out there, get people talking, and to beg researchers. I could come up with a list of, if anybody's listening, I could come up with a list of 20 dissertation topics that need to be explored. If anybody is out there hunting around for a master's thesis or a dissertation topic of things that we know nothing about that should be looked at. Here's just one example. I interviewed a woman on my show. They're all amazing. She was amazing. She grew up in poverty without a father. Her mother was drug involved, and they lived day to day with no money. And her mom was very neglectful. And she had an older brother by the name of Patrick. She was about 6 or 7 years of age when her mother said to her, "Your brother's taking a nap upstairs. Go wake him up." Knowing full well she had murdered her son. So this little girl was ordered to go wake her brother up. And when she pulled the blankets back, she saw what she saw. I'm not even going to go into what she saw. So she went into foster care, and then she was bounced around. And I wanted to find out, what is the developmental repercussions on sibling death at the hands of a parent. Think I could find anything on that? No. There are so many untouched topics that we need to have researched, not spend another minute talking about serial murderers. I'm so up to my eyeballs in that, because the chances of you dying of a serial murderer are so infinitesimally small compared to dying in a car crash or from cancer or a heart attack that you shouldn't even be on the radar. But it makes revenue, I guess.
So maybe one idea, and not that you need more work to do, but maybe one idea is just take all your ideas and make an ebook out of it. Looking for dissertation ideas, and then you have your list, and the little that you do know, it might spark someone's interest. Because there's so many overdone dissertations. Like,
absolutely,
why not do something that will make a difference?
It's actually helpful. Yeah. You have to do the research anyway, so might as well make it practical. Yeah.
Jan, we have to start wrapping up.
Okay.
I think we could talk for a couple hours. Like, your story is really powerful. I hope it helps someone listening that's experienced the aftermath of a loved one being murdered. I hope that it provides them some comfort and hope that there is life after, and you certainly are living a really full life. So thank you for everything that you're doing.
You're welcome. And if I could end on my favorite quote, I would love to.
Please. Absolutely.
It was from Helen Keller. And she said, "Although the world is full of suffering, it is also filled with the overcoming of it."
It's pretty powerful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for listening in today. Please join us next week, same day and time. Also, I would love for you to check out my website, healthrivedream.com.